Welcome to the Redeemed Backslider with your host, Kathy Chastain, Christian-based psychotherapist and redeemed backslider. This podcast is dedicated to those who have wandered but are ready to return to the life-changing power of grace and the freedom found in Jesus.
Hi, welcome to the Redeemed Backslider. I'm your host, Kathy Chastain. I'm a Christian-based psychotherapist, and I'm a redeemed backslider. With me today in the studio is my colleague, Kelly Ventura, who is a pastoral counselor and coach. And we're going to pick up where we left off in episode 1 about the loss of innocence, healing the whole person. But before we do, I just want to say to everybody that watches, thank you for watching. And going through the analytics, it looks like 46% of you guys have not subscribed. So you probably hear this if you watch YouTube very often. If you subscribe and like our videos, it actually distributes it more into the whole YouTube world, which allows us to reach more viewers, which allows us to hopefully reach more backsliders. So if you are a returning listener, if you could please like and subscribe our channel, that would help us a lot. But mostly it will help the kingdom of the Lord if we can reach the backsliders. So with that, we're going to just jump right in and we're going to pick up where we left off. Last week, we talked about the whole person and the different types of attachment that exist in all of our lives and how that could potentially affect our walk with God. And so we're going to recap for you today. Kelly, you want to recap what it means to be the whole person?
Sure. Well, we talked about, bringing our whole, and let me just say too, so if you're watching, we were talking about this before we came on the podcast. If you are watching, you notice I have a black shirt on. It is not the same black shirt. It has been several days. In fact, it is a Saturday now. So if you're watching, you'll see that I have actual, like little 5 o'clock shadow here. So it is Saturday morning.
I asked him when he came in, hey, did you wear a black shirt last week?
And I did. And I, if you look at my closet, I have, the color palette in my closet is of a 19th century melodrama villain. So it's pretty much black is all that I have. So anyway, black and t-shirts. My wife loves it. So anyway.
So I made him self-conscious because he had
so now
black
I'm
on
self-conscious. Now I'm completely thrown out of the podcast. No,
sorry.
But no, bringing your whole person to God, body, soul, mind, and spirit. And we were talking specifically in terms of salvation when we talked about God, save or fills our spirit, saves our soul. But we bring our whole entire person, body, also to God as well. And, bringing these things to God, we have to understand that even though we are quote unquote saved, right? Or even if we are in a position where we feel like we've stepped away from our faith or fallen away from our faith or however you want to term it, we still realize that we have these struggles, right? In our mind and in our body, in our spirits, that even though, and one of the amazing things for me is that even though we have these struggles, we body, soul, mind, and spirit, we have these things, whether it's been wounds from attachment or whatever the case might be, God's love is still pure to us.
Right.
And he loves us as the whole person. But then we started talking about last time about attachments also. Do you want to kind of recap kind of the different attachments?
Yeah. So, when we come into this world, we are created perfect, we are an innocent, clean slate that nothing is written on us. Except generational bloodlines, which we'll get in later. But we come into this world as a clean slate. And so we are partly formed by nature or nurture. Nature being our biology, what we brought in from our parents, right? And then also nurture, which is our environment that we are molded in. And that's where attachment kind of comes into play. If we have a wonderful, loving home with attentive parents, intentional parents, then we have secure attachment. We grow up feeling secure. We have a ton of ability to have resilience, in distress. We easily can manage emotions because we have a secure base. Then we have avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, and disorganized attachment. And all of those are rooted in the different kind of environments that we're molded in, right? So disorganized is when parents are both loving and abusive, and the child gets very confused by that. Avoidant is often comes from when there's been emotional neglect and physical neglect. Your just needs as an infant and toddler are not getting met at all. So there's no way to attach emotionally or to feel safe and secure because the rest of your needs aren't getting met. And then there's anxious attachment, and anxious attachment often comes from abandonment, where a caregiver or parent has left, not been available emotionally, or there's been divorce or even a death. And so all of these ways that our parents or caregiver interacted, it could even be a grandparent, really has an effect on us as a whole person. And so with that, we're going to talk how those attachment styles, how they sort of funnel down into two basic wounds. And I would say from a mental health perspective, most diagnoses can be rooted in these two wounds. Kelly, what would you say those are?
I would say abandonment, and rejection.
Yeah.
And I think that when we talk about abandonment, I think when people have that wound, I think that when they come to church or when they're in church or they're exposed to church, I think that they see everyone around them. They feel the presence of God. They feel all these wonderful things. But for some reason, sometimes it's kind of like, if I have that wound of abandonment, is my church family going to leave me too?
Right.
Are they going to give up on me too if I'm not perfect? Is God going to give up on me?
Right. Right.
Everyone else left me. It's not a question, sometimes in their minds, right? It's not a question of if they leave me, right? It's when will they leave me? And I think rejection comes in, especially in the church. I think it comes in when people assume or they think, am I good enough?
Right.
And again, it's not a when, it's an if. It's when I am rejected, it's going to be inevitable.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't leave, it doesn't leave space for grace. It doesn't leave space for any of those kinds of things in your life. But people kind of have those thoughts that kind of prevent them sometimes from connecting with God, connecting with others. That kind of is some of the things that I've seen.
Yeah. Right. So I want to just sort of talk about where some of this can come from. So I hear, in the counseling practice, a lot of people will say, well, I had a good childhood, I don't really remember anything too bad. I mean, clearly, if there's overt abuse, people will remember that. Right. But a lot of people grow up in households where divorce occurred, but they'll say something like, oh, I don't really remember, or I know my parents fought a lot, but I don't really remember, or whatever, But if, and we talked about this last time, divorce, I think divorce is a hugely underestimated trauma that kids go through. And if 51% of America are divorced and 51% of marriages have ended in divorce, there is often an abandonment wound and or a rejection wound. And I've seen both. And so abandonment occurs when there is through experience or perception, and perception is huge because, I tell this example all the time. I can say that this wall is green,
Right.
but the person sitting across from me can say that this wall is sage or olive green. And so the way we see things and the way we perceive things and the somatics that we use to discuss this can all create tons of miscommunication and confusion.
Mm-hmm.
And so perception is huge. And so it is the real life experience or perception of being left behind emotionally or physically by someone who was expected to love you. Right? Because what that leaves is the feeling that I'm not loved.
Or I don't matter.
Right. And so the core experience could be feeling alone, feeling forgotten, or discarded, which creates a fear of being left again. Hypervigilance in relationships that often manifest as clinginess, codependency, emotional withdrawal to protect against loss.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that person who, when they get a boyfriend or they get a girlfriend, they break up first. They're going to break up with you before you can break up with me.
Before you break up with me. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
But the root cause is loss of a caregiver through death, divorce, incarceration, addiction. And I would say incarceration is a big deal, especially in our area because, because of the area that we live in, but also addiction. Addiction is rampant.
Yeah.
Even in the church, addiction is rampant. And when a person comes from a home like that, the caregiver might be present physically, but they're not present really in any other ways. And so some symptoms of abandonment can be fear of intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is huge, right? Like, I'll get close to you, but only so far.
Right.
You want to talk about that, Kelly?
Yeah, no. And I think what happens too is that fear of abandonment kind of drives an internal monologue inside of us sometimes that says, if I'm perfect, then they won't leave me.
Right.
And I think it kind of creates this desire inside of people to overcommit, to overdo it, to stress, especially in the church, to stress, I'm going to be perfect. I'm going to do all of these things. Yeah. Never mind, it's not tearing my family apart, but it's I'm being pulled away from my family, being pulled away from my loved ones, but I'm going to overcommit because I've got to be perfect.
Right.
Because if I'm perfect, other people are going to love me, and if I'm perfect, then God's going to love me. Right.
Perfectionism shows up both in abandonment and rejection, and it's huge, and that's rooted in shame, and like we said last time, all that is so interconnected. We're going to get to shame in our next episode, because what I want to sort of help people understand and convey is how all of this is affecting our mind, our emotions, our physical flesh, and our spirit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because most of what happens in childhood is felt. It is experienced. And based on that experience, I'm going to have an instinctive reaction. So for me, and this shows up here, this is where we get into fight, flight, or freeze. So for me, I was more rebellious. When I got hurt or people left or my needs didn't get met, I fought back, right?
Yeah.
Other people, they freeze or they fight, flight, freeze, or they they leave. But when
Right.
they freeze, they become super passive.
Right.
Often those people are rule followers. Often those people are people pleasers because they're just trying to do whatever they can do to get back to a decent place of connectedness. And often those thoughts in our minds, which has formed belief systems,
Right.
are no one's sitting here thinking, oh, I'm acting this way because of my childhood.
Yeah,
They're
that
just
connection's
very
not made, yeah.
subconsciously responding.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's very true. And I think that panic sometimes of and fear creates us, or causes us rather, to kind of go into that paralysis, right? Sometimes we're so in our head sometimes that we can't make that next move. And so we just do that freeze maneuver, and we kind of become passive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So what, so abandonment, through a face, I think I said common symptoms, fear of intimacy, being
Right.
alone, anxiety, distrust, overfunctioning, trying to earn love, which I think is what you were saying, Kelly.
Right. Yeah.
And a feeling of panic or despair when somebody leaves or
Right.
someone that they value or want, right?
Right.
We're going to get into the faith-based piece in a second. But let's go through the rejection wound, because I think we're going to break down how both of these lead to a very fear-based response system, right? Okay, so fear, so rejection, let's see, hold on. Sorry, let me look up my note. Rejection wound is the emotional pain resulting from being excluded, unwanted, or judged as unworthy, whether overtly through bullying or betrayal, or subtly through a lack of affirmation, or a lack of, or a hyper sense of criticism. So if, let's say you're the kid that grows up, and I've seen this, and it's devastating how much bullying affects a whole person throughout their entire life.
Yeah.
They could have a secure home attachment, wonderful parents, but they go to kindergarten and they get bullied because they have red hair, or they're just a little bit chubby, or maybe they're a little skinny. Or maybe the girl is just too tall in elementary school, or maybe the girl begins to develop prematurely before the rest of her classmates do, or whatever. The boy has facial hair too early, or the boy is too short. Like, there's so many reasons that kids get bullied. That creates a rejection wound, which creates an identity crisis. And so, so rejection has its own fallouts, but that idea of being unwanted, that could even come in the womb. And I've seen this where parents have wanted to abort their child and then chose at the last minute to keep the child. Somehow that parent mistakenly, wrongly communicates that to the kiddo.
Right.
And even though they know the parent loves them in their mind, they still have this underlying belief, but they didn't want me. Yeah. And so that question always exists. Or you have the kid, I've seen this too, where you have a sibling that gets straight A's and is the athlete, and the other sibling doesn't get very good grades and is not the athlete, but they're really creative and very expressive. And so comparison. Or you have the parental figure that's hypercritical. Like, all of these things and so many more that we don't have time to discuss creates rejection.
Right.
So Kelly, how does all of that really create a fear? And what areas, if we look at interpersonal relationship, social relationships, and work relationships, if we're just looking at those basics, how do you think this stuff shows up in fear for those people interacting in life?
Yeah, I think that feeling unwanted and having that feeling inside of you, I think that is one of, in my opinion, one of the major drivers of imposter syndrome.
Oh, can you elaborate on imposter syndrome? I think people may be familiar, but elaborate on that.
Right. It's just this feeling of I don't have what it takes to be here, and pretty soon somebody's going to figure that out.
Yeah, like calling, we used to say calling BS on somebody.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's this fear that has been imposed on us that for whatever reason, because we're unwanted, that I'm unwanted in this position, whatever it might be. I might be a CEO, I might be a CFO, I might.
Well, let's just talk about being a preacher.
Yeah, it happens in ministry as well. If you're in ministry and you may have had that in your past, God helps us, and prayer is something that can help us connect to God's divine plan and God's divine love for us, and we understand all that. But sometimes there's that stuff that kind of just comes up, and sometimes being having that imposter syndrome in ministry is kind of like, here's where it is in ministry. It's like, I don't have what it takes to be here, or I for whatever reason, because of my background, I should not be here. And all of those things are untrue, but they are, in a spiritual sense, in a positive spin on it, they are true as well.
Right.
No, you don't.
I love that.
You don't have what it takes to be here because of God's grace. Right. You are here. And, Paul says, nothing's going to separate us from the love of God. The gifts and calling of God are without repentance. So once you're there, and God has given you that gift, right? And so sometimes they feel like, somebody's going to figure out that I don't have. Somebody's going to figure out that you have a story, a background. Somebody's going to figure out that, yes, you have we call them testimonies, right?
Right.
You have a reason for why you have a story, and that has driven you to where you are now and put you where you are now. So sometimes we look at imposter syndrome in ministry as a bad thing, and I guess it can be if we kind of let it take us down a negative path, right? But I say flip it on its head sometimes and go, no, you're right. I don't have what it takes to be here, except by God's grace. That's why I'm here.
Yeah, and I love what you said, because sometimes two things can be true at the same time, right?
Right.
And I think that we don't always stop to realize that I can be, I flunked out of high school. That is true. My little GED hangs on my wall with my master's degree, because I'm such a late bloomer. But I never forget where I've been, you know? And so it is, both of those things can be true. I did flunk out of high school. Totally.
I barely passed high school.
But I also, fixed it. Right. And so I remember when I was in the fitness industry for many years before I changed careers. And my girlfriend worked for one of the cosmetic surgeons here. And she says, hey, so-and-so needs a personal trainer. I told him about you. He wants you to train him. And I was like, that imposter syndrome just completely hit me because I had certificates to do what I was doing, and I knew what I was doing, but I couldn't tell you anatomy because at that time I hadn't even been to college. Right. I couldn't tell you what bones were connected to this and what muscle was connected to this. And I was terrified. I'm like, I'm going to be in a surgeon's home training them. And what if he asks me, which abdominal muscle are we working right now? I would not be able to tell him. Oh, the transverse.
You don't know?
I mean, I knew the basics, but I didn't know the intricacies, right? And I remember I just thought, because believe it or not, I still prayed and talked to God. I'm like, well, I'm going to show up. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to show up, and I'm just going to be me and do what I know to do. But that is where that fight, flight, freeze comes in. That's where if a person's natural tendency is to move into fear and just avoid it completely because they're afraid someone's going to call you out on what you don't know. I mean, it's huge.
Right.
Imposter syndrome is huge. And I think for ministry leaders, because that we're human, right? We all know who we are, and hopefully we are living a sanctified life.
Right.
But there are still things that come against us. And so if we're in a valley, and you've got to get up and preach about praise or talk about joy because you speak what you need, right? You plant seeds for what you need to grow. It would be very disconcerting, it'd be very difficult. So I think that all of this is about fear and, always going back to that place where it kind of exists.
Yeah. And then there's all, when talking about, that sort of disconnect that you feel when you are preaching something and I need to inspire people because, they want and they need to, whatever, they need to praise, they need to, I need to talk to them about prayer or encouragement or whatever the case might be.
Or God gives you a message about something you're not feeling at all, but you have to be obedient.
Been there, done that, bought the t-shirt and burned it. But yeah, I have been there. And so having that in your head in ministry, you've got to go, okay, this is not maybe necessarily where and when I first started out in ministry, I understood none of this, but you have to kind of go, okay, this may not be where I am right now, but this is where the people need to be right now. This is where God's people need to be right now.
And then you just become a vessel.
And at that point, you are the conduit, by which, and so sometimes I think even people listening, when you look at ministry in your life, keep that in mind.
And Kelly, so how hard would that be? Knowing that, okay, God gave me this word, I have to deliver it, and I don't feel any of it. I don't feel worthy. I can't even, I'm not here emotionally. Like, what do you think ministry goes through in terms of having to overcome that? And as you answer, I want you to specifically talk about our will to what we choose, the dichotomy of emotion, right? I'm not feeling it. This is what I have. The difficult, what you have to overcome in order to be obedient to the Lord in that way.
I think once we get to the point where we realize and we think, okay, I don't feel this, and I'm not
struggling with imposter
syndrome. I'm struggling with this. All these things are battling against me. We have to get to the point where in ministry, I say I had to get to the point in ministry where God just said, you know what, Kelly, yes, you're struggling and you and I are going to figure this out together. But at this point, it's almost like
not about you.
It's almost a soldier mentality, right? It's like,
elaborate on that.
It's like a soldier is going to feel fear. He's going to feel anxiety. He's going to feel all these things. Of course, my dad's a Marine, and Marines aren't supposed to feel all those things.
If you're watching on YouTube, we had some technical difficulties with our camera, so I will not be on the rest of the episode, but we have some great graphics for you to look at in my absence, and the audio will continue. So we apologize.
They're going to feel all those things going in, but at some point, there has to be that understanding. I am defending country. I'm defending, whatever the case might be, right? There's a higher calling to what I'm doing.
It's about the unit and purpose.
Right. And so in ministry, it's the exact same thing. Part of dying out to self is not just dying out to, is dying out to our flesh and our desires. That's part of it. But it's also dying out to who I think I am and
ego.
What I'm struggling with, and to put that aside and go, right now, God and I are going to take care of this. I'm assuming, again, right, we're living a life that's pleasing to God, but we all are humans and we struggle with stuff, right?
Yeah.
we have struggles with thoughts and imposter syndromes and all these things. But at some point, it's got to be like, okay, God, we're going to take care of this later. Right now, God's people need to be, taught. God's people need to be inspired. God's people need direction. God's people need all of these things. And so I think that God is saying, you know what, I called you to do this.
Mm-hmm.
How you feel right now,
Mm-hmm.
this is harsh, but sometimes we have to get to the point where how I'm feeling right now is immaterial.
Yeah.
Weighed against how people are going to be affected by what I have to say that God gave me.
Yeah. 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 That's
So
good.
that's part of dying out to ourselves too.
Yeah.
And dying out to how we think it should happen, how I should show up, how I should be,
Mm-hmm.
and how I should be worthy. It's part of that mental checklist in our head. As long as we've done all these things, then I'm worthy.
Yeah.
But like Jeff Arnold preached years ago, right? He preached that message, God is greater than our heart and knows all things. For if our heart condemn us not, then we think we're great, right?
Right.
But if our heart condemns us, God's greater than our heart and knows all things. But in actuality, we have to realize that, when we get up to speak, God knows us.
Yeah.
And God's going to use us anyway.
Right. In spite of
Right.
where we've been and what we've done. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, when it comes to wounds, this is a huge burden of mine. Is I've said it before, it's on our website, that God came to heal the broken heart, because I really see the human condition from a place of woundedness until the Lord really comes in and does a work in a person's heart. And so a lot of times when we come from difficulty, when we come from things that hurt us, often people are operating from a place of emotion, and emotion is what dictates their life. If I'm angry, I'm going to act angry. If I'm sad, I'm going to act sad. And every decision that I make along the way is going to be based on what I feel. And when we come into a place of healing with the Lord, God heals our emotions and our thought processes. We begin to then make decisions based on what is true, not what we feel. And that's a little bit of a journey. And so, common symptoms from people that have been rejected are people pleasing and perfectionism, which we've already said. Self-rejection, beating yourself up, telling yourself, oh, I'm just this, or I'm that, or I'm not good enough, or I'm too fat, I'm too skinny, don't seem good enough, I'm, not smart enough, all the not enough things that we can then walk in a place of extreme guilt and condemnation. And I'm just going to interject this really quick. If you have been raised in or have gone to, I'm trying to say this delicately, a church that lacks the Spirit of God and maybe lacks the fruit of the Spirit. If you don't have a shepherd who is really loving the sheep, who is really there to encourage the sheep and to, help lift you up so that you can become closer to God. If you go to a church where you have a dictator for a pastor, or you have somebody who tells you all the rules, and the minute you don't do the rule, they're condemning you, it is very easy for the enemy to come in and create that condemnation in your thoughts, and a person will live in extreme guilt. And especially for people growing up in church, that's a lot of what happened. That is a lot of reason why backsliders left, is because, they were just expected to be something. And we bypass the healing process that actually comes from the work that Jesus did on the cross, right? And so we're only addressing sometimes in church, not our church. I always say that. But sometimes in church, and I think it's just kind of a lack of understanding. This isn't for every church, but sometimes in church, they're only dealing with the soul of a person, which is the mind, will, and emotions. You know, they're only dealing with the spirit of a person to get saved, to get you to heaven. They're not dealing with the whole complete person of who that person is and how they behave out of these issues of life that they have lived through, right? Mm-hmm. So we have people that come in that's, you know, been in prison who, I mean, I've known a lot of people who have been in prostitution, human trafficking. It is way more common than what we ever realize, especially in a church culture, because church cultures don't talk about that stuff. Right. But you have these people that come in that are having all of this real lived experience. And sometimes if we're not sensitive to the Spirit of God, we're not really addressing that. We're just telling them, get cleaned up and just get on the train and live for God. It just isn't that simple.
Yeah. And while the outside, I think, is important, I think it's, again, the two ideas, right? It's at the end of the day, the Spirit of God is in my view, and I've said it before to people, is the Spirit of God is the great regulator.
Yeah.
Right?
Talk about that.
So it helps us with all of these things. You know, we talk about emotional regulation, right? And how to not be, like you were saying, manage your emotions before they manage you, right?
Right.
Or to regulate those, or to make sure that they're not taking over every decision, like you were talking about, every decision that you're making. And I think that the Spirit of God being this great regulator is because he, the Spirit of God fills our spirit, saves our soul, affects our entire person.
Right.
We can bring all of those emotions that are really, emotions are just those really like dashboard indicator lights that, hey, you got to take care of something, underneath here, right? And what that looks like is taking those emotions to God in prayer and going, God, I need your help with this. I'm feeling anxious about my marriage. I'm feeling anxious about my relationship with a loved one. I'm feeling all of these things. I need you to help me regulate through that.
Right. And you and I know that.
Right.
And you and I know that God will take care of that. Right. But what about the people who don't know that, or the people who, backsliders in particular, who had really negative experiences, both at home and then in the church?
Right.
How do we bridge that gap for them to where they can begin to see God like that? Because what do you think their ability to trust God is like? Or where do you think their places of fear is that prevents them from being able to take that step in prayer or even in vulnerability to approach the Lord?
I think ultimately it's a fear of being judged, because fear frames God not as it frames God more as a judge, rather than
and religion does that
redeemer
too, right?
Right.
I mean, we can either be heavy on grace and we teach about a God who never judges, who never is righteous, the righteous judge. Or we can teach about a God who is so holy, and he is, all of that is true, is so holy that unless we're that holy, we're going to hell, right? How? And we know that he is both, he is both. But what would you say to the mindset where you have someone that only sees God as the judge, the one up in heaven pointing the finger at you saying, you're not this, you didn't do this right, you've done too many things, or if you come back, you have to do all of these things. What would you say to that?
And it's
like, where is that coming from in them?
Well, that's coming from a place of a fear of being judged, because I want, somehow they got in their head, somehow we get in our heads, right, that if I am this way, then I am good.
Right.
But we have to understand that I have to understand that God loved us before we, quote unquote, got good.
Right.
So that love, regardless of where we find ourselves in our walk, that love is still there.
Okay, so I know that logically, but I didn't have that grown up. Not me, I did. But what if I'm a person who lived in survival mode all of my life, and I don't feel safe, and I didn't experience safety in love.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what thoughts and what emotions am I going to have to overcome in order to get to know God in this way?
Yeah. It is going to come from being able to, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen with anyone else, but just a time with you and God alone. Because everyone, regardless of where we're at in our life, we have those times where we talk to God.
Right.
And to be able to understand and go, okay, what I say to people that feel that way is go, and I say that God loves you in your most vulnerable moment.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how to be vulnerable?
It's difficult.
Yes, right.
But to be able to show your deepest fears. I just bumped the microphone. Your deepest fears, your deepest concerns, your deepest regrets, the things you struggle with. All of these things, Bishop, where we go to church, used to say, showing God everything. He used to use the phrase warts and all, right?
Yeah.
Meaning all the bad stuff that I struggle with, and all of the stuff that happened in my past, all of these things that I can bring to God and go, here it is. It takes courage. It doesn't have to happen in a church setting. It doesn't have to happen in anything that's really great. It can happen in your living room and go, God, maybe it's been a while since you've reached out to him, but go, God, these are all the things that has happened. Mm-hmm. And to realize that even though you're sitting in the middle of all these things, mm-hmm. right, that the judgment that man put on you, God is never going to put on you.
Right. And, we don't really know that until we decide.
Right. We have to get to a point.
We decide to give God a chance, because I think no matter what, and I've said this before on the podcast, people are going to get it wrong. They're going to disappoint you, and they're going to say the wrong things, hurt feelings. But most of the time, it is completely unintentional. A person's heart is not meant to do that necessarily, right? It's just that when we come from an abandonment wound or a rejection wound, our lens has already become distorted. It goes back to confirmation bias. I'm going to begin to see through this lens of what I believe to be true already about myself, or what I believe to be true about the world around me, about relationships, about God, about ministry, about Christians, right? Because we get accused all the time of being hypocrites. And I would say, yeah, okay, but it's not on purpose, because there's a big difference. And there are hypocrites, for sure, that is intentionally living double lives. But I would say the majority of Christians who are really endeavoring to pursue God, they're just doing the best they can with what they have.
Right. And there's hypocrisy is We often think of hypocrisy as being unique to the church, and
it's not.
It's not. It's hypocrisy is in the corporate world. Hypocrisy is in, how many times, have we heard of someone being, insider trading or something like that?
Yeah.
Hypocrisy is everywhere. And so I think when we realize that hypocrisy isn't necessarily a symptom of the church, it's a symptom of humans.
Yeah.
I think that helps, at least in my head, that helps me go, okay, so hypocrisy is not about God.
Right.
Hypocrisy is about the human that just kind of mess things up.
Yeah. And, I think that when a person comes from a place of fear, when I'm working with a client and let's say they're struggling with anxiety or depression or anger or resentment or hurt or sorrow, any of those things, so frequently it can be drilled down into either fear or the not being good enough narrative.
Yeah, those are the two main ones.
And sometimes they're the same, right? But at the root of it is fear, which does not come from God. But if I am afraid to be exposed, if I am afraid to be vulnerable, if I am afraid to give God a chance because my perception of him has been one of judgment, or I've seen this too, where God didn't show up. I saw a kiddo whose dad died right in front of them. And that kiddo prayed that God would save the dad and let him live. And the dad died. And that kiddo has a very distinctive memory of asking God to save his dad. And then he didn't, And so people have these experiences that prevent them from, risking that trust again, being able to take that risk and trust. I remember one time, and I cannot remember the circumstances, but I remember where I lived, and I remember being on my hands and knees, desperate for God. And the way that I explain this is, and I can't remember if I had already rededicated my life or not. I think I had. Yeah, I think I had. But I just really needed God to show up. And I literally felt like I was on the edge of a cliff. And if God didn't show up, I was going to fall over to my death. And in that moment, I understood how people suicide because there is such a hopelessness and a fear. You cannot see any hope beyond that.
Yeah.
And I remember telling God, if you do not show up, and I didn't really have a specific way I needed him to show up. I just knew I needed something. And feeling like my ability to have faith would forever be jeopardized. And that was just the emotional, feelings that I was having at that time. But I remember I just prayed until I couldn't pray anymore. And I got up, dusted myself off, metaphorically speaking. Right. And I went about my day. And I remember a couple hours later, the load had lifted. And there was not anything that happened. There was not any, earth-shattering moment that proved God came in and
no angel choirs,
rescued the day. Yeah. My circumstances didn't change. I didn't have any aha moment, but there was a marked change in the peace that I felt. And it was enough to be okay to keep going. Again, I wasn't suicidal, but I was afraid that I would lose faith,
Yeah.
And so I know that people very much live in these crossroads
Right.
and these dichotomies. They really want to trust God. They really want to approach him and believe, but they just don't know how.
Yeah.
And often it is because there is a deeper wound in our the way we see the world and in our emotions, and just overall in life, and sometimes in our flesh through
Right.
disease, through accidents, through all sorts of things.
Yeah. And I think that ultimately, wherever we're at, whatever when, wherever, however we're perceiving God or whatever the case might be, I think that ultimately there is a moment where I don't think there's just one moment that God says, I'm just going to give you one opportunity. But I think there's sometimes that there's that moment that comes to us, like you, right? I'm at the edge of this cliff.
Yeah.
So sometimes situations in our lives force us to get to that moment. Sometimes we make that choice to say, this is the moment, right?
Right.
Sometimes, this things happen in life and we're like, you know what? This is the moment, right? But I think ultimately we have to go, okay, we have to make that choice in our mind and in our spirit and go, okay, I know what my past has been. I know how I have viewed God in the past. And all that comes into play, and all that is a factor. I'm not dismissing that.
Right.
But I'm just saying we bring all of that with us.
Right.
Once we make that decision to go, okay, I'm going to make that one step, and it could be that one prayer that you pray, right?
Right.
And nothing big happens, not a lot. I have found that the most significant moments spiritually in my life have not been the big, somebody comes and gives you the word or
Right.
something like that, and there's this big boom, It has just been in I prayed, got up, went throughout my day, had forgotten that I had prayed about X or A, B, C, D or whatever the case might be, right? And all of a sudden, it all falls into place. I'm like, oh, cool, it fell into place. And God's like, yeah, remember this morning when you prayed, or yesterday when you prayed about this? Yeah, that's me taking control of this. That's me, answering. I prayed once when I was a young minister. I went to a conference once and I was praying. I was like, God, you gotta, give me a word. You got to give me a word. Like a lot of people do, and a lot of people get words, and that's great. And I was praying and had my hands lifted up, and I was crying out, and I needed a word. And Brother Mark Morgan comes over to me, and I'm like, oh, great, here comes Mark Morgan. He's going to give me the word that I need. And he starts to pray for me, and I'm like, all right, I'm listening. And he just leans over. He's a great friend of mine now. He leans over in my ear, and he goes, God's already told you what to do. Now you just need to go do it.
Wow.
And he
Humbling.
he left, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'm done." So it's kind of like those kind of moments that in fact, once I got to know him better and did some work for him and got to know him and the family and stuff. I asked him about that one day. I was like, "Hey, you remember this?" He goes, "No, I don't remember that." But it was one of those moments where it was like, wasn't anything big, wasn't anything huge. It was just. And I knew exactly what he meant. That was the funny part. I knew exactly what he was talking about. So sometimes it's just those moments where it's like, this is not going to be a big moment, but it's going to be something like you were saying, I need God right now.
Yeah. 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 And when people come to the table wounded, it's everything to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I, the importance of our choice is huge, because the whole reason God gave us free will is so that we would choose from a place of knowing and a place of desiring, and not from a place of performativeness. God is not going to perform for you.
Right.
And so that sincerity and that vulnerability has to really, really be there. But, I would say that, ironically, trust is also built in these moments,
Mm-hmm.
when you are willing to risk and you're willing to say, God, man, I'm going to take this step, because what if I'm wrong? What if what I thought was incorrect? What if you really are who the Bible says you are?
What if? Yep.
Yeah. Because there's all these what ifs on the negative side,
Right.
but there's also what ifs on the positive side.
Yep.
Like, what if God did catch me, which he did that day? What if God really can make all things good in your life? What if God really can take away your fear and anxiety and give you a purpose, right?
We often think, what if this is the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to me? We flip that over and go, okay, what if this is the absolute best thing that could possibly happen to me? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And the enemy shows up. The enemy shows up in our thoughts. He shows up, like, our instinct in our fallen nature is negative first. And so part of what we learn as we become Christians, or as we, take another step towards God, is I have to learn how to rewire that and be aware. Okay, my first instinct is this. Someone told me once, give everything 24 hours.
Yeah.
I use that all the time in therapy now. Because if you give everything 24 hours, you're not going to react out of instinct, which often isn't always going to be good.
Right.
It's going to allow you to react out of intentionality, and living for God, especially in the beginning, is often out of intentionality.
Yeah.
I'm choosing to try. I'm choosing to explore. I'm choosing to trust. And then when you get the experience of his love and his peace that comes along with it, it makes it easy. But we're not bumping up against the goodness of God. We're bumping up against our own fear and our own flesh and our own ego and our own pride that is preventing us from taking that step with him.
Absolutely. Yep.
And that's the dying process. And man, our ego will give us a really great fight.
Most definitely. Yeah. And trying to, come to those moments where everything, it's difficult because everything around you is screaming, do this, do that, take it into your own hands. And sometimes making that step of trust, no matter how small, it could just be driving in your car and going, I need you, God, when I go to this meeting, or I need you, God, to do this. And he follows through and does it. You're open with him. You're vulnerable with him, right? And I tell people kind of in couples counseling as well, it's kind of like, the more you are vulnerable with each other, the more trust will be built between you,
Yeah.
Hey, I told someone my deepest, darkest concern in life, right? I told this person that, and they did not, text it to their friends. They didn't make fun of me. They didn't, whatever. Right. Oh, okay. I have then a little bit of trust to share a little bit more.
So what's the principle in that? Do you know?
You're going to tell me. I have a feeling.
Yeah. The principle is that we have to take the first step.
Right.
And then we get to learn that it's safe. It doesn't become safe first.
Right.
It becomes safe once
first.
It's completely unsafe, which is contrary to our need, right? Especially if we have any kind of wounds, we are looking for safety and security. And God is asking you to take a step first and trust. And I was just going to say something and I lost my train of thought, but it was going to be good.
Well, I have a story about that too. So my daughter was learning, she had already learned how to swim, and she was learning how to, there's a difference between swimming in the pool and learning how to dive into the pool, right? Uh-huh. So she was learning how to dive into the pool. She was younger, and she was actually in the pool at the house that we're at now. Anyway, so she was getting ready. I just said, jump in. I said, I'll catch you, and she wouldn't do it, and she wouldn't do it. And so trust and faith go hand in hand.
Right.
So she was standing at the edge of the pool. She goes, no, you're going to drop me. And I said, no, I'm not. So finally she jumps into the pool. I catch her. She swims back to the edge and jumps again. So she's got the trust that says, Dad did it before. So that gives me faith to swim back to the edge of the pool and jump again.
Right. I was going to ask you to delineate between trust and faith.
Yeah. Trust says God has done it in the past. Whether I read it.
No, I mean, using this example with Lauren in
this
the
example.
pool.
Yeah, in this example. So her trust was Dad caught me.
Because why?
He did what he said he was going to do.
Because she loves you. And
Correct.
Because you have shown up for her.
Right.
And because she has relationship with you.
Right.
So that allows me the ability to trust you.
Right.
Okay. And then
and
that allows for faith to take place.
Yeah. And I have to say, and you know this, I'm a little bit of the smart aleck. So I was tempted to not catch her. Right. And just let her see what it felt like. But then I thought, well, then I'm going to damage her trust and her faith.
Correct.
For later jumps.
Right.
So I didn't. And she did the same thing over and over again. And now, at that point, all she wanted to do was jump off the edge of the pool.